The sun had barely risen when Sarah Matthews put on her sneakers for her morning run in Central Park. The century-old trees cast long shadows on the still dewy asphalt as the park's first visitors began to circulate. At 42, she maintained a rigorous routine that reflected her methodical approach to life. Everything had to have a logical explanation, a clear purpose. "Good morning, Ms. Sarah," greeted Joe, the smoothie vendor who had occupied the same spot for years. "You look a bit pale today. Don't you want to stop for a drink?" "Not today, Joe. I need to keep my pace," she replied, forcing a smile while adjusting her earphones. The truth was that she hadn't been feeling well for days. A constant restlessness accompanied her, along with a growing sense of emptiness that no scientific explanation seemed to resolve. A science teacher at the prestigious St. Christopher's School, Sarah dedicated her mornings to running and her afternoons to teaching teenagers that the universe could be understood through formulas and experiments. Ironically, her own life was beginning to challenge this premise. As she ran, memories of her childhood in Vermont invaded her thoughts. She saw herself small, sitting on her grandmother Betty's lap, listening to stories about angels and miracles. "God is everywhere, my flower," Grandma would say, her eyes shining with a certainty that Sarah could never share. Over time, the girl, who believed in mystical stories, transformed into a woman who only trusted what she could empirically prove. Sweat trickled down her forehead as she increased her pace, as if she could leave behind those uncomfortable memories. Her heart beat faster and faster, and pressure began to build in her chest. "It's just fatigue," she thought, determined to complete her lap around the park. That's when she felt it, a sharp pain, as if something was crushing her heart. Sarah staggered, her legs weakening. The world around her began to spin, colors mixing in a confused whirlwind. She tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out. In the distance, she heard alarmed voices. "Help, someone's passing out here. Call 911, quick!" Her body fell onto the asphalt, but strangely, she didn't feel the impact. It was as if she was floating, moving away from her own body. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was Joe's worried face, leaning over her, praying something she could no longer hear. Suddenly, the darkness dissipated. Sarah found herself enveloped by a soft, welcoming light, unlike anything she had ever experienced. There was no more pain, no more fear. An inexplicable peace surrounded her as she realized she was in a place completely different from the park. Before her stretched a breathtaking landscape. Golden mountains rose on the horizon, their slopes covered with vegetation that changed color with every movement. Rivers of crystal-clear water meandered through verdant valleys, and in the air, sublime music filled every space. They weren't notes she knew, but a harmony that seemed to emanate from existence itself. "This can't be real," thought Sarah, her scientific mind struggling to process what she saw. It must be some kind of hallucination caused by lack of oxygen to the brain. But as she tried to rationalize the experience, a presence approached. It was a male figure, emanating a light so intense that it should blind her, but it didn't. His eyes conveyed a love so deep and unconditional that Sarah felt her defenses beginning to crumble. "Welcome, Sarah," said the figure, his voice reverberating, not just in her ears, but throughout her entire being. It was Jesus. She knew this with a certainty that transcended any logic. "You have many questions, don't you?" Tears began to stream down Sarah's face as years of skepticism dissolved in the face of that presence. How could she have doubted for so long? How could she have reduced existence to mere chemical equations? "Why am I here?" she finally managed to ask, her voice trembling with emotion. "To see what your eyes refuse to see," he answered, extending his hand. "Come. There is much I need to show you." And so, Sarah Matthews, the teacher who always needed concrete proof to believe in something, began a journey that would forever change her understanding of reality. Meanwhile, in Central Park, paramedics frantically fought to bring back to life a body that had stopped breathing exactly 3 minutes ago. Jesus' hand held hers with a gentle firmness as they walked through that extraordinary realm. Sarah noticed that her body, if she could call it that, seemed lighter, more vibrant. Each step was like floating, and colors she had never imagined possible danced around her. "What is this place?" she asked, marveling at how the grass under her feet emitted small pulses of light with each touch. "It's a reflection of the kingdom of heaven," Jesus replied, his smile illuminating the environment even more. "But you're seeing only a fraction of what it really is. Your earthly eyes are not yet prepared to contemplate its full glory." As they walked, Sarah began to notice other presences, luminous figures moving with supernatural grace. Some seemed to be involved in activities she couldn't fully comprehend, creating structures with thoughts, composing music with colors, studying patterns that seemed to be the very essence of creation. "Sarah, Sarah, my flower!" That voice. Sarah froze. It was impossible but unmistakable. Turning around, she came face to face with her grandmother Betty, not as she had seen her in her last days, fragile and debilitated in a hospital bed, but radiant, young, and full of life. "Grandma," whispered Sarah, her heart overflowing with emotion. The two embraced, and Sarah felt a love so pure and intense that she began to cry again. It was as if every moment of pain and separation had never existed. "Oh, my little granddaughter," smiled Betty, wiping Sarah's tears with fingers that seemed made of light. "You were always so stubborn. You needed to see to believe, didn't you? Just like your grandfather." Jesus watched the scene with a compassionate smile. "Your grandmother has been one of your main intercessors, Sarah. Her prayers were like seeds planted in your heart, even when you thought you had completely abandoned faith." Sarah looked at her grandmother with new eyes, realizing how much love was behind every story she told, every prayer she made. "Forgive me, Grandma, for doubting everything you taught me." "There's nothing to forgive, my flower. Everyone has their time and their path, and now you're here, seeing with your own eyes." Jesus then led them to a kind of natural amphitheater where various souls gathered. Sarah was impressed to realize that she could understand all the languages being spoken simultaneously, as if there was a universal language of the Spirit. "Look there," her grandmother pointed to a particular group. Sarah recognized famous scientists from history, engaged in an animated discussion with ancient philosophers and renowned artists. There were no divisions or hierarchies, just a continuous exchange of knowledge and mutual admiration. "But how can this be?" asked Sarah, observing how scientific theories and spiritual truths intertwined perfectly in the conversations. "On Earth, science and faith always seem to be in conflict," Jesus smiled. "The conflict exists only in the limited understanding of men. True science and true faith are like two sides of the same coin, different expressions of the same divine truth." As she absorbed these words, Sarah noticed something extraordinary. She could see the molecular structure of things around her, but also their spiritual essence. It was as if she could finally see reality in its totality, without the limitations of earthly perception. "Come," called Jesus, "there is something else I need to show you." They headed to an area where an immense tree stood, its branches reaching impossible heights. Its fruits constantly changed shape and color, and its leaves emitted a light that seemed to contain all the wisdom of the universe. "The tree of life," explained Jesus. "Its leaves are for the healing of the nations, and its fruits bring eternal renewal." Sarah reached out, touching one of the leaves. At the moment of contact, she was flooded with a deep understanding of the purpose of existence, not as a mathematical formula, but as a symphony of divine love echoing through all creation. Her grandmother watched her with tears of joy. "You see, my flower? This is what I tried to explain to you when you were little. God is not an equation to be solved, but a mystery to be lived and loved." However, as Sarah absorbed these revelations, a strange sensation began to manifest. It was as if something was pulling her back, as if her time there was coming to an end. Jesus looked at her intensely. "You need to go back, Sarah. Your work on earth is not finished yet." "No," she protested, clinging to her grandmother's hand. "Please, I want to stay. There's still so much to learn, to understand." "And you will learn," Jesus assured her, "but not here. Not now. Your journey on earth has a greater purpose than you imagine." Before she could protest again, Jesus showed her a vision. Her father, George, was in the hospital, his hands trembling as he held a rosary. Her students had organized a prayer vigil in the school chapel. Even her colleague Richard, the physics teacher who was as skeptical as she used to be, was there, in respectful silence. "They need you, Sarah," Jesus said softly. "And they need what you've learned here." Her grandmother hugged her one last time. "Don't worry, my flower. I'll always be with you, even if you can't see me. And one day, when the time is right, we'll meet again." Sarah felt tears running down her face as the light began to dim. The last thing she heard was Jesus' voice. "Remember, Sarah, true life is not in matter, but in connection with divine love." And then, everything went dark. "We have a pulse. She's coming back." The paramedic's voice sounded distant, as if coming from another world, and in a way it was. Sarah felt a sharp pain in her chest as air invaded her lungs again. The daylight seemed harsh and artificial compared to the softness of the place she had just left. "Ma'am? Ma'am, can you hear me?" Sarah blinked several times, trying to focus her vision. The paramedic's worried face became clearer, as did the sounds of the park around her. People murmuring, sirens in the distance, the bird song that now seemed strangely musical. "Yes," she answered hoarsely. "I'm here. You had a heart attack. You were without vital signs for almost 10 minutes. It's a miracle you're back." Miracle. The word echoed in her mind with new meaning. How could she explain to them that she had been in a place where miracles were the very essence of reality? "Miss Sarah," Joe approached, still holding his rosary. "Thank God you're back. I've been praying the whole time." Sarah smiled weakly, now recognizing the importance of those prayers she would have previously dismissed as superstition. "Thank you, Joe," she murmured as she was prepared for transport. At Mount Sinai Hospital, the next few hours were a whirlwind of exams, beeping monitors, and doctors surprised by her extraordinary recovery. Her father, George, arrived running, his eyes red from crying. "Honey," he hugged her gently, afraid of hurting her. "I thought I'd lost you." "Dad," Sarah held his hand tightly. "I saw Grandma Betty." George froze, his eyes widening. "What do you mean, honey?" "I was somewhere else." She hesitated, searching for words to describe the indescribable. "It was all so real, Dad. So much more real than this." The doctor, who had just entered the room, cleared his throat softly. "Mrs. Matthews, it's common for patients to have hallucinations during cardiac arrests. The brain deprived of oxygen." "They weren't hallucinations," Sarah interrupted with a firmness that surprised everyone, including herself. "Doctor, I'm a science teacher. I've spent my entire life basing my beliefs on empirical evidence, but what I experienced transcends any scientific explanation we can offer." The doctor smiled condescendingly, making notes on his clipboard. "Well, the important thing is that you're stable now. We'll keep you under observation for a few days." When she was alone with her father, Sarah tried again. "Grandma is exactly as she was when I was little, Dad. She sent a message for you. She said she still keeps that wooden top you made, and it's still her favorite toy." George turned pale. "But that's impossible. Your grandmother never told anyone about that. I had made that top in secret when I was 7. I only gave it to her on the day his voice faltered. At that moment, something changed in the room. The late afternoon light coming through the window seemed to take on a different quality, almost supernatural. Sarah realized she could still see something of the other world, not with the same clarity as before, but like an echo, a living memory, imprinted on her soul. "Dad," she whispered, "I need to tell you everything, and I need you to believe me." In the following hours, Sarah described every detail of her experience. She talked about the light, about Jesus, about the tree of life. She told about the scientists and philosophers she saw talking in perfect harmony, about the colors that don't exist on Earth, about the music that was made of light. George listened in silence, tears running down his face. When she finished, he finally spoke. "Your grandmother always said you had a special purpose, that one day you would understand." A soft sound interrupted the conversation, messages arriving on Sarah's phone. They were from her students, asking about her condition. Among the messages, there were photos of the vigil they had held in the school chapel. "How am I going to explain this to them?" asked Sarah, more to herself than to her father. How can I go back to teaching science classes after seeing that reality is much bigger than our microscopes can show? Maybe that's exactly why you needed to come back, George replied, with a wisdom that reminded her very much of his late mother, to show that science and faith don't need to be enemies. Sarah closed her eyes, exhausted, but at peace. For the first time in a long time, she felt complete. The doubts that had tormented her for months had been replaced by a quiet certainty. Not an arrogant certainty, based on irrefutable proof, but a humble certainty, born from the experience of divine love. As she fell asleep, she could swear she heard very far away that celestial music that she now knew had always been there, just waiting for her to learn how to listen. The days in the hospital dragged on with a slowness that contrasted drastically with the eternity Sarah had experienced. Each exam, each medical visit seemed superficial compared to the depth of what she had lived. However, this same experience had given her a new way of seeing even the most mundane moments. She watched fascinated as the sunlight created patterns on the hospital floor, reminding her of the perfect geometric structures she had seen in the other world. Each person who entered her room was no longer just a physical body, but a walking mystery, an eternal soul temporarily inhabiting a material form. It was during one of these observations that Richard, her fellow physics teacher, came to visit her. He seemed uncomfortable, holding a bouquet of flowers as if it were a particularly difficult equation to solve. "The flowers are from the students," he explained, placing them on the table. "They miss you." Sarah smiled, realizing how much her colleague was struggling to maintain his usual skeptical posture. "You were at the vigil," she said, not as a question but as a statement. Richard adjusted his glasses, nervous. "Well, the students insisted. You know how these things are. Institutional solidarity and such." "Richard," Sarah gently interrupted him, "it's okay to have doubts. I had them too. In fact, I still have many. The difference is that now I know that doubts are not enemies of truth. They're part of the path to it." He sat down, his expression changing. "Sarah, the doctors commented about your experience, about what you say you saw during the cardiac arrest. As a scientist, you must know that there are neurological explanations for this. The brain, when deprived of oxygen—" "Yes, I know," she completed. "Just as I know that no neurological explanation can justify the fact that I know about the top my father made for my grandmother, something no one else knew. Or about the birthmark you have on your back, in the shape of a half-moon." Richard turned pale. How do you know that?" "Because I saw," she answered simply. "I saw you as a child, hiding that mark from your classmates in swimming class. I saw how much it hurt you, and how it made you seek scientific explanations for everything, as a form of control." The physics teacher stood up abruptly, pacing around the room. "This is impossible. You had no way of knowing." "Impossible is a word that has lost much of its meaning to me, Richard," Sarah smiled. "You know what I learned. That true science isn't about denying what we don't understand, but about keeping an open mind to all possibilities." At that moment, a nurse came in to check Sarah's vital signs. Richard took the opportunity to say goodbye, clearly shaken. Before leaving, however, he stopped at the door. "Sarah, do you think—" He hesitated. "Do you think there really is something beyond what we can measure and prove?" "I don't think, Richard. I know. And the best part is that this knowledge doesn't diminish my love for science at all. On the contrary, now I see that each scientific discovery is just another window into the divine mystery." After he left, Sarah picked up her phone and started making notes. She had so many ideas for her classes now. How to show students that the laws of physics weren't just cold formulas, but expressions of a higher intelligence. How to demonstrate that the complexity of DNA didn't diminish the miracle of life, but made it even more extraordinary. Her mind was buzzing with possibilities, when a familiar sensation enveloped her, that same peace she had felt in the other world. For a moment, the hospital walls seemed to become transparent, and she could see or perhaps feel her grandmother's presence. "Keep going, my flower," whispered a voice that was more feeling than sound. "You're just beginning to understand." Sarah fell asleep smiling, her notebook still in her lap, dreaming of a new way of educating, one that would unite science and spirituality in a harmonious dance of discoveries and revelations. After 2 weeks of recovery, Sarah was finally discharged from the hospital. Her return to St. Cross School was marked by a mixture of apprehension and expectation. How would her students react to the new Sarah? How would she herself react to returning to the classroom with such a transformed perspective? Standing in front of the school gate, she took a deep breath. The century-old building, with its neo-Gothic architecture, seemed different now. The ancient stone walls were no longer just a historical construction. They were silent witnesses to countless journeys of discovery and transformation. "Professor Sarah!" Marianne's voice, one of her most dedicated students, pulled her from her thoughts. The girl ran to hug her, followed by a group of students. "You don't know how hard we pushed for you to come back." "We made a prayer chain," exclaimed Luke, a student who had always stood out for his skepticism. "Even I, who never believed much in these things." Sarah smiled, touched by the sincerity in the young people's eyes. "I know, Luke, I saw you." "What do you mean, saw?" asked Marianne, curious. "Come with me," Sarah invited, walking towards her classroom. "I have a story to tell you." The room was exactly as she had left it. The board still had chemical formulas from the last class she had given, molecular models organized on the shelves, the solar system poster on the wall. But now each object seemed charged with a deeper meaning. "Before we start our class," Sarah said, sitting on her desk as she used to do when she wanted a more informal conversation, "I need to share something with you, something that completely changed my way of seeing the world and science." For the next 40 minutes, Sarah narrated her experience. Unlike what many would expect from a science teacher, she didn't try to rationalize or diminish the supernatural aspect of what she had experienced. She spoke with the same precision she used to explain chemical reactions, but now her words carried an additional dimension of meaning. "Professor," interrupted Peter, a student who had always been fascinated by quantum physics, "are you saying that you saw the molecular structure of things there? On the other side?" "Yes, Peter, but not just that. I saw the spiritual essence behind matter. You know, when we study that matter is made mostly of empty space. There, I could see that this emptiness is actually full of something our science still can't measure, something we could call divine love." The room was in absolute silence. Even the most restless students seemed hypnotized by the narrative. "But then," questioned Luke, "does this mean that everything we study in science is wrong?" "No, Luke, it means it's incomplete. Science is like a flashlight. It illuminates part of reality, and it does that very well. But there are other dimensions of existence that need different types of light to be seen." Sarah got up and walked to the board. With a gesture that surprised everyone, she erased the old formulas and began to draw something new, a diagram showing the intersection between the material and spiritual worlds. "From today on," she announced, "we're going to study science in a different way. We're not just going to memorize formulas and do experiments. We're going to try to understand how each scientific discovery brings us a little closer to the divine mystery that permeates all creation." "Will the board allow this?" someone whispered at the back of the room. "Actually," a voice answered, from the door, making everyone turn, "the board is very interested in this new approach." It was Sister Cecilia, the school principal, who had apparently been listening to the conversation. Her austere face had an expression softened by emotion. "Sarah," she said, entering the room, "for years I've been trying to find a way to integrate science and spirituality into our curriculum. Maybe you were sent back precisely to help us in this mission." At that moment, Sarah felt a wave of inexplicable gratitude. She remembered Jesus' words, "Your work on earth is not finished yet." Now she was beginning to understand what that meant. The bell rang, marking the end of class, but no one moved. The students remained seated, their minds processing everything they had heard. Sarah looked at each young face in front of her and saw something new awakening in their eyes. The same thirst for knowledge as always, but now mixed with something deeper, a glimpse of true wisdom. The following weeks were of intense transformation at St. Cross School. Sarah's new approach in her science classes began to generate waves that spread far beyond the walls of her classroom. Students from other classes asked to attend her lessons. and teachers from different disciplines began to question their own methodologies. On a particularly significant morning, Sarah arrived at the teachers' lounge and found an animated group in discussion. In the center, Richard was gesticulating energetically. "But don't you understand," he was saying, holding a quantum physics book. "Modern science itself is showing us that reality is much stranger and more mysterious than we imagined. The observer influences the experiment. How can we ignore the philosophical and spiritual implications of this?" Sarah smiled, remembering the skeptical Richard from a few weeks ago. His transformation had been one of the most surprising. After that visit to the hospital, he immersed himself in studies that combined modern physics with ancient mysticism. "The question is not to abandon the scientific method," Sarah intervened, sitting down with her colleagues. "It's to expand our understanding of what is possible to observe and measure." Professor Helena, of literature, who had always kept her distance from scientific discussions, approached timidly. "You know, since you came back, Sarah, I've been thinking a lot about how great writers always knew this. They described realities beyond our world long before quantum physics." The buzz in the teacher's lounge was interrupted by the arrival of Sister Cecilia. Her countenance was more serious than usual. "Sarah, we need to talk," she said. "I received some complaints from parents. They're concerned about the new direction of your classes." A tense silence settled in the room. Sarah felt her heart race, but not out of fear. It was a calm certainty that this moment was also part of her purpose. Of course, sister. But first, I'd like to show you something." Sarah opened her laptop and began to present the results of her students' latest tests. Not only had the grades improved significantly, but the depth of the answers and the ability to make interdisciplinary connections were remarkable. "And there's more," she continued, opening another folder. "These are voluntary projects that the students developed. Luke, who before barely took an interest in class, is researching the relationship between meditation and brainwaves. Marianne is studying the mathematical patterns in Tibetan mandalas." Sister Cecilia adjusted her glasses, examining the documents carefully. Her face gradually softened. "You know, Sarah," she finally said, "when St. Francis founded our order, he spoke about seeing God in all things, in science, in nature, even in animals. Perhaps we've forgotten that along the way." Richard, who had been observing the scene, stood up decisively. "Sister, if I may, I think we need to do more than just defend Sarah's classes. We need to expand this approach." "How so?" asked the Iki principal, intrigued. "What if we created an interdisciplinary project, something that would show how science, spirituality, art, and philosophy are different faces of the same truth?" Sister Cecilia's eyes sparkled. "Go on." For the next 2 hours, the teachers engaged in an animated discussion, planning what would come to be called the Bridges Project, an initiative that would seek to build connections between different areas of knowledge based on Sarah's transformative experience. As she watched her enthusiastic colleagues, Sarah felt that familiar sensation of peace. For a moment, the walls of the teacher's lounge seemed to dissolve, and she could see thousands of golden lines connecting, each person present, as if each were a point of light in a vast web of meaning. This is how it should be, she thought. Not divisions but bridges, not walls but windows. That night, upon returning home, Sarah found an unexpected email. It was from an important research institute in São Paulo, inviting her to give a lecture about her experience and her new teaching methodology. Apparently, the waves of change were spreading far beyond the walls of St. Cross School. Before going to bed, she opened her diary, a habit she had developed since her return. As she wrote about the day's events, she realized she could hear very softly that celestial music she had known on the other side. It was no longer a distant memory, but a constant presence, reminding her that the two worlds were much closer than people imagined. The auditorium of the Advanced Research Institute was packed. Sarah observed from the wings as the audience settled in, a curious mixture of scientists, educators, religious figures, and spiritual seekers. Her father, George, seated in the front row, gave her an encouraging smile. "5 minutes, Professor Matthews," one of the organizers warned. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. Since her experience, she had learned to find that space of peace even in the busiest moments. It was then that she felt a familiar presence beside her. Sarah Matthews. She turned and found herself facing an elegant lady, appearing to be in her 70s, with lively and penetrating eyes that seemed to contain universes. "Dr. Maria Luisa," Sarah whispered, immediately recognizing the famous neuroscientist who had dedicated her career to the study of near-death experiences. I didn't know you would be here." "Neither did I," smiled the scientist. "Until yesterday I was in Portugal. But something, or someone, told me I needed to be here today." Before Sarah could respond, she heard her name being announced. It was time. As she stepped onto the stage, Sarah felt something different in the air, as if several dimensions were overlapping in that moment. While adjusting the microphone, she noticed that some people in the audience seemed to emanate a soft light, almost imperceptible to ordinary eyes but clear to her new sensitivity. "Good evening," she began. "I am a science teacher, and until a few months ago I considered myself a convinced skeptic. Today, I'm here to share how I died for 10 minutes and came back with a new understanding of reality." The next 2 hours went far beyond a simple lecture. Sarah shared not only her experience, but also how it had transformed her way of teaching and understanding science. She presented data, graphs, and results from her students, demonstrating how the integration between science and spirituality had improved not only academic performance, but also the personal development of the students. During the question session, a young researcher raised her hand. "Professor, how can we be sure that your experience wasn't just a hallucination caused by lack of oxygen in the brain?" Sarah smiled, remembering how she herself would have asked that question a few months ago. That's when Dr. Maria Luisa stood up. "If I may," said the neuroscientist, "I'd like to share something. For the last 40 years, I've been studying cases, like Professor Sarah's. What few people know is that I myself had a similar experience 2 years ago, during heart surgery." A murmur ran through the auditorium. Maria Luisa was known for her rigorously scientific approach. "What Professor Sarah described," she continued, "corresponds exactly to patterns we've identified in thousands of cases around the world. People, from different cultures, religions, and educational levels, report consistent elements: the light, the feeling of peace, the encounter with beings of light, the deep understanding of reality." Sarah watched, amazed, as the renowned scientist validated her experience with data and research. But the most impressive was yet to come. "And there's something else," said Maria Luisa, turning to Sarah, "something I haven't told anyone yet. During my experience, I was also in that place you described. And I saw you there, Sarah. I saw when Jesus showed you the tree of life. I saw when your grandmother hugged you. I was there observing, although it wasn't yet my time to interact." The auditorium fell into absolute silence. Sarah felt tears running down her face as memories of that sacred moment returned with new clarity. Yes, now she remembered. She had felt a presence observing, although at the time she had been too absorbed in the experience to notice. "What we are witnessing here," continued Maria Luisa, her voice choked with emotion, "is not just an isolated account. It's evidence that there is a greater reality, a dimension where time and space function differently, where consciousnesses can meet beyond physical limitations." After the lecture, while people were still processing what they had witnessed, Sarah and Maria Luisa gathered in a small room. George joined them, bringing coffee. "It wasn't a coincidence you were here today," said Sarah, holding the scientist's hands. "No, it wasn't," agreed Maria Luisa. "Sarah, I need to tell you about a project I'm developing. We're creating a research center dedicated to the study of consciousness and its non-physical dimensions. But we don't just want to do research. We want to create a bridge between academic science and spiritual knowledge. Like the Bridges project we started at the school," murmured Sarah, beginning to see the connections forming. "Exactly. And we want you to be part of this. Your experience as an educator, combined with your spiritual experience and scientific background, is exactly what we need." George watched the scene with tears in his eyes, remembering his mother Berenice's words. One day Sarah will understand her true purpose. As they talked planning the next steps, Sarah realized she could see again those golden lines connecting everything and everyone. But now they weren't just visible. She was beginning to understand how to work with them, how to help weave this divine web that united science and spirituality, reason and faith, the visible and the invisible. The following months were of intense activity. The Bridges Project at St. Cross School had transformed into an educational model that was beginning to be adapted by other schools. The research center envisioned by Maria Luisa was taking shape, with Sarah dividing her time between classes, and the development of methodologies that integrated science and spirituality. On a Saturday afternoon, while organizing materials for a workshop, Sarah received an unexpected visit. It was Luke, her most skeptical ex-student, now in his first year of physics at USP. "Professor," he said after initial greetings, "I need to tell you something. Remember that project on meditation and brain waves that I started in school?" Sarah nodded, noticing how different the young man seemed, more mature, more centered. "Well, I turned it into my undergraduate research project, and we discovered something amazing." Luke opened his laptop, showing complex graphs. During deep states of meditation, the brain emits wave patterns that are mathematically identical to those we find in entangled quantum particles. Sarah felt that familiar shiver of recognition. This was how the deepest truths revealed themselves now, through synchronicities that connected the scientific and the spiritual. "But there's more," continued Luke, his eyes shining. "Remember when you told us about seeing golden lines connecting everything? Well, some theoretical physicists are proposing that the universe is actually a vast network of quantum information, where everything is interconnected at a fundamental level." "Like a divine loom," murmured Sarah, remembering something Jesus had shown her during her experience, a vision of reality as a living fabric where each thread was a consciousness, each knot a moment of encounter. At that instant, as if to confirm the conversation, a golden light began to fill the room. It wasn't a physical light, but that special luminosity that Sarah had learned to recognize, the presence of the divine manifesting in the ordinary. Luke stopped talking, his eyes widening. "Professor, are you seeing this?" "You can see it too?" asked Sarah, surprised. I think so. It's as if I could see connections between things, as if everything were alive?" Sarah smiled, moved. It was the first time someone else had shared her expanded perception of reality. "Luke, remember when we studied about quantum observers? How the observer's consciousness affects the experiment?" The young man nodded, beginning to understand. "Are you saying that by studying these phenomena, by opening our minds to these possibilities, we're developing new senses?" completed Sarah. "It's not about seeing things that don't exist, but about learning to perceive what has always been there." At that moment, Maria Luisa entered the room bringing new research data. She stopped, feeling the special energy of the environment. "Ah," she smiled, "I see you're perceiving it too." "Doctor," said Luke, still amazed, "did you know this was possible? That we could develop this sensitivity?" "My young man," she replied, sitting down with them, "what we're discovering is that human consciousness is much more expansive than we imagined. Sarah's near-death experience wasn't an end. It was a beginning, a door opening to new possibilities of perception and understanding." The three spent the following hours sharing experiences and insights. Luke told about how his colleagues at the university, initially skeptical, were beginning to take an interest in his research. Maria Luisa shared data from other researchers around the world who were reaching similar conclusions through different paths. "It's as if we're witnessing a collective awakening," observed Sarah, seeing the golden lines intensify around them. "An awakening that unites science and spirituality," added Maria Luisa. "Exactly as you saw on the other side, Sarah." The Center for Integrated Studies, as Maria Luisa and Sarah's project was called, grew rapidly. In less than a year, it became a hub for revolutionary research that attracted international interest. Scientists, mystics, educators, and spiritual seekers from all over the world came to participate in programs that combined scientific rigor with openness to transcendental experiences. On an especially significant morning, Sarah was preparing for an important event, the first international conference on expanded consciousness and integral education. The center's main auditorium was packed with people from different countries and traditions. As she adjusted her microphone, Sarah felt that familiar, loving presence. It was as if the veil between worlds was particularly thin that day. Looking at the audience, she could clearly see the golden connections between all the people, forming a complex and harmonious pattern. "Welcome," she began, her voice calm and firm. "A year and a half ago, I had an experience that completely changed my understanding of reality. I died for 10 minutes and visited a place beyond our physical dimension. But the most important thing wasn't what I saw there. It was what I learned about here." As she spoke, Sarah noticed something extraordinary happening. The golden lines she used to see were becoming visible to more people in the audience. Expressions of amazement and recognition appeared on many faces. "What we are witnessing now," she continued, "is just the beginning. The separation between science and spirituality was a temporary illusion. In fact, they are two languages describing the same divine reality. That's when something unexpected happened. The light in the auditorium began to pulse softly, not in a physical way, but at a frequency that everyone could feel in their hearts. It was as if the environment itself was responding to Sarah's words. Maria Luisa, seated in the front row, stood up emotionally. "Sarah," she said, "it's happening exactly as you described from your experience. The music of the spheres, the colors beyond the visible spectrum." All over the auditorium, people began to share what they were perceiving. Some saw colors never before imagined, others heard sublime music that seemed to come from all directions. It was as if a dimensional door had opened, allowing everyone to experience a glimpse of what Sarah had experienced. "This is not a collective hallucination," Sarah explained, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's a collective awakening. We are developing new senses, expanding our perception to encompass realities that have always been here, but that we couldn't perceive before." Luke, now a respected researcher, ran to the stage with his laptop. "The instruments are recording," he exclaimed. "There are energy patterns we've never seen before, but that correspond exactly to ancient mystical descriptions of prana, chi, life force." The experience lasted only a few minutes, but its impact was profound and lasting. When the intensity began to diminish, it left behind not just memories but a permanent change in the perception of all present. "What happened here today," said Maria Luisa, coming on stage to join Sarah, "is just the beginning. We are witnessing the evolution of human consciousness. Sarah's near-death experience wasn't an isolated event. It was a portal, an invitation for all of humanity to take the next step in its evolutionary journey." Sarah watched the amazed audience, recognizing in each face that same awakening she had experienced during her experience on the other side. It was as if each person there was a small flame lighting up, contributing to illuminate the world in a new way. At the back of the auditorium, she saw her father, George, embracing Richard. Both were crying silently, but their faces shone with a deep joy. Near them, several students from St. Cross School, past and present, shared their own perceptions of the extraordinary moment they had just experienced. And then, for a brief moment, Sarah saw something else. Her grandmother Bernice, radiant and young as she had seen her on the other side, smiling in approval. Beside her stood Jesus, his gaze conveying that same unconditional love she had experienced during her experience. "Continue, my flower," her grandmother's voice whispered in her heart. "The divine loom is only beginning to reveal its most beautiful patterns." A year passed since that extraordinary event at the Center for Integrated Studies. The collective experience lived that day spread like waves in a lake, touching lives far beyond those present in the auditorium. Sarah was again in Central Park, in the same spot where her journey had begun with that cardiac arrest. The sun rose lazily behind the trees, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold that seemed to dance between dimensions. "Good morning, Miss Sarah," called Joe, still at you. his coconut water stand. But now his smile had a different glow. He too could see the golden lines connecting all things. "Good morning, Joe," she replied, smiling as she noticed how the coconut water vendor had become one of the many lighthouses scattered throughout the city, people who, after that day at the center, developed the ability to perceive and work with the subtle energies of reality. Sarah sat on a nearby bench, letting her mind wander over the events of the past year. The Bridges Project had expanded to schools across the United States, and other countries were beginning to adopt similar models. The separation between science and spirituality was gradually dissolving, giving way to a new way of understanding and experiencing reality. Her cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Luke. He had just defended his doctoral thesis, proposing a new model of quantum physics that incorporated consciousness as a fundamental element of the universe. The examining board, composed of traditional scientists and contemporary mystics, had approved the work with distinction. As she read the message, Sarah sensed a familiar presence beside her. She didn't need to look to know it was her grandmother. Now she could feel her presence as clearly as she felt the warmth of the sun on her skin. "See my flower," said Bernice, her voice clear as music. "Sometimes we need to die a little to really start living." Sarah smiled, remembering her experience on the other side. Now she understood that there weren't really two worlds. There was only one, seen through different levels of perception. Death was not an end but a passage, a change of frequency in the eternal dance of consciousness. Her phone rang again. It was Maria Luisa, reminding her of the meeting later. UNESCO representatives would come to learn about the center's work, interested in developing a global education program that integrated science, spirituality, and consciousness development. Getting up from the bench, Sarah began her morning walk. But now it was no longer a solitary run. It was a conscious dance with life itself. Each step was a prayer, each breath a communion with the divine that permeated all things. The people passing her in the park, runners, cyclists, families strolling, all seemed different now. In each face, she could see that spark of recognition, that gradual awakening to a greater reality. They were no longer just physical bodies moving through space, but eternal consciousnesses experiencing the adventure of existence. The sun was already high when Sarah finished her walk. She stopped again at Joe's stand, now accepting that coconut water she had refused on the day of her near-death experience. "You know, Mrs. Sarah," he said, as he served the water, "the other day I was thinking, you needed to go all the way to heaven to help us see that it's already here, isn't it?" Sarah smiled, touched by the coconut water vendor's simple wisdom. "That's true, Joe. Sometimes we need a great journey to discover that the destination has always been within us." As she savored her coconut water, Sarah contemplated the busy park. The golden lines that only she used to see were now perceived by more and more people. The divine loom continued its eternal work, weaving consciousnesses, moments, and possibilities into a pattern of infinite beauty. And there, on a simple park bench in New York City, Sarah Matthews, the teacher who needed to die to really start living, felt a deep gratitude. Gratitude for her journey, for every person who had been part of it, and for the opportunity to be a small light helping to illuminate the path of others. The new day had truly dawned, not just for her, but for all who were ready to see with new eyes, hear with new ears, and feel with a renewed heart the ever-present truth, that there is no real separation between science and spirituality, between matter and consciousness, between the human and the divine. Everything is one. And in that unity, each of us is a precious thread in the eternal weaving of divine love.